Hello, my name is James Robson, and I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. The Asia Center's Author Conversation series is aimed at highlighting insightful engagements with authors of books published recently by the Asia Center Publications Program and other publishers on topics of interest to the Asia Center's mission of fostering research on Asia in transnational and transregional perspectives. We very much hope you enjoy the conversations. It's my pleasure today to have Professor Sugata Bose and Ayesha Jalal to discuss their book, Oceanic Islam, Muslim Universalism and European Imperialism, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2020. In fact, it's hot off the press. So we're really happy to have you both here today to be able to discuss this book. Professor Sugata Bose is the Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University. His main field of specialization is modern South Asian and Indian Ocean history. He obtained his Ph.D. from the University of Cambridge and was the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1997. His books include 100 Horizons, The Indian Ocean in the Age of Global Empire, from 2006, and also The Nation as Mother and Other Visions of Nationhood, 2017, and a co-written volume with Ayesha Jalal entitled Modern South Asia, History, Culture, and Political Economy in the fourth edition of 2017. Ayesha Jalal is the Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts University, who specializes in the history and politics of Pakistan and India. And she received her PhD in history from Trinity College at the University of Cambridge, and in 1998 was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship. Her books include Self and Sovereignty, Individual and Community in South Asian Islam in 2000, and also The Pity of Partition, Monto's Life, Times and Work Across the India-Pakistan Divide of 2013. So thank you both for joining me as part of this author conversation series of the Harvard Asia Center. And I'd like to begin with what I found a very interesting and perhaps even a provocative statement that you both write in the preface to this very encompassing book. And it makes even a broader claim that I think most readers would be really interested in hearing you elaborate on. So in the preface, you make the claim that the future balance of global power will be determined in large measure by policies of key actors in the Indian Ocean and the lands that abut it, rather than in the Atlantic or the Pacific. So could you explain a little bit some of the thinking behind that claim and just to lead us into our larger discussion?
Well, it was, James, a provocative claim. I think located as we are on the east coast of the United States, we take to the Atlantic much more easily. We constantly talk about transatlantic relations, or the ways in which, for example, the current President Trump has been undermining transatlantic relations. On the other hand, I think enormously important processes are underway in the Indian Ocean interregional arena. In strategic economic terms, most of the energy resources of the world flow through the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and the South China Sea taken together. Perhaps one point which that claim of ours doesn't fully capture is the way in which the Indian Ocean and the Pacific are beginning to be talked about together with the rise of China. And way back in 2007 in the Indian Parliament, the Prime Minister of Japan, the former Prime Minister now, Shinzo Abe, had talked about the confluence of the two seas. But even if there is a certain connection that is becoming more politically salient right now, the Indian Ocean zone, I think, is of absolutely critical importance, and not least because Islam as a cosmopolitan idea has been so important in that arena.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for me, as a reader of the book too, it's really fascinating to see how your work aligns with other scholarship that I've noticed going on in a wide variety of fields of a shift to taking the importance of water and waterways, whether it's rivers or oceans, into consideration. And the Indian Ocean region, as you call it, the interregional arena, I thought was a very nice phrasing of that, is quite interesting because literally India is enveloped by this whole Indian Ocean region on both sides. And then, of course, the famous rivers that are flowing there. And even going back to the original wording, the Indo-Aryan word for sea of Sindhu, and how this was transformed, I think, as a scholar of religion, it's fascinating for me, the evolution of that term into what became Hinduism, and it has a very interesting etymology to it. So this shift that you all in this book note away from, say, the focus that has been so important for so long, particularly in people who study trade and movement of people, ideas, and things, which tended to focus on the so-called Silk Road, which we know is a problematic term, but away from land caravans and port cities to actually to boats and ships, rivers, oceans. So, and also the travel movement of people, ideas across those waterways. So for you, what does that mean? And that shift of focus, what are the implications for that, for the history of Islam? And also what fresh perspectives might that bring to the history of Islam and also the history of the region?
I think one of the things that we have highlighted is the fact that there is a dichotomy between the emphasis that has been given to the study of port cities and the population of Muslims. I mean, most of the port cities do not have a majority Muslim population. The majority populations are in the Gangetic Plain. And I think that's what we were trying to show, that the presumption that the cosmopolitanism is confined to ports is not actually correct when you account for rivers. And the connections between rivers and oceans and people's movements. And I think that was what was really attempted here, is to connect cities in the Gangetic Plain to the broader Indian Ocean arena. That's what I think can have large implications. I mean, I think that I regretted, I still do, that we didn't include the Irrawaddy and Burma, but I think that that's something that should be done. And I think so there's a lot more to be done here in making those connections. And I think that specific cities and individuals who have come from the heart, the hinterland, and gone into and used the ocean connections, I think those are the stories we still need to hear.
I might add that overland connections are also important, but we were emphasizing that Islam traveled well by sea on boats and ships. Fernand Braudel had once written Islam is the desert, and posed a counterclaim saying Islam is the sea. But we also followed Braudel's lead in doing exactly what Ayesha was explaining, that how far deep into the South Asian landmass does the Indian Ocean's influence spread. And just as Braudel talked about the land isthmuses, which connected the Mediterranean with various parts of Europe, we suggested that the river routes, particularly of the Indus, the Ganga, also the Brahmaputra, were of critical importance in bringing a large part of this extended alluvium, stretching from the Indus in the west to the Ganga and the Brahmaputra in the east, as part of an Indian Ocean world. Now, even though we didn't directly address the Irrawaddy or Burma in our introduction, there are a couple of essays later on in the volume which bring in the story of Burma. There is Iftikhar Iqbal's essay looking at Bengal, spreading towards Southeast Asia, Bengali Muslims in particular, and also Sana Iyer's essay looking at Muslims and Buddhists cooperating in colonial politics in Rangoon and other parts of Burma.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. I'd like to come back in just a minute to this notion about movement. Obviously, when we're speaking of water, that this is really, I mean, it's often, I think some people think of large waterways as impediments. Often even just crossing a river was a big deal before crossing oceans, obviously in the pre-modern period. But from a different perspective that I think that you emphasize in this book, water is about connections and bringing things together, movement. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but since you mentioned the work of Braudel, I thought it seems a perfect place to begin to just clarify a little bit your views about Braudel and his work. I mean, this is a natural place, I thought, for you to begin, and I believe in the preface begins with a quotation from Braudel very early on. And this notion of a kind of Mediterranean world is something that even for those of us even working in East Asia, some have started to think about the connections, say, between China, Korean Peninsula, and Japan as a kind of Mediterranean complex as well. And so I would like to ask you if you could to explain a little bit about, you've already mentioned a little bit about Braudel's views, but you also nuance and even push back a little bit about certain concepts of Braudel's in the preface to the work. And so I wonder if you could say just a little bit about what the main modifications that you made to Braudel's voluminous work and the implications of that for your own work.
Yes, James, I think you've hit upon something. We, as historians, have an ambivalent relationship with Fernand Braudel. We draw on some of his insights, but we also depart from his perspective. You know, one of the things which Braudel claimed in much of his work is that geographic structures are constants. And that is why, if you read his great book on the Mediterranean, one of the earliest sections is titled Mountains Come First. And I think both Ayesha and I understood why he said so when we tried to drive in a Fiat Panda with an 800cc engine from Annecy to the coast of the south of France, you know, crossing one mountain range after another before reaching the Mediterranean. But we make the claim that particularly in the deltas of great rivers, everything is transient, the physical environment. The rivers are shifting, whether the Indus or the Ganga or the Brahmaputra, and we describe that quite a bit. Of course, we focus on the period when the British are exploring the Ganga and the Indus, James Rennell in the east, Alexander Burns in the west. But we also look at geographic structures as dynamic and changing, and that's, I think, something that is extremely important. That's where we depart from Braudel. And we also suggest that it's not land routes, as in the case of the Mediterranean and Europe, but these river valleys that are of great importance, particularly in tying Punjab and Bengal to the Indian Ocean.
You might be interested that, where Braudel talks about the mountains as static in that sense, there was actually a pre-modern Japanese Buddhist thinker who completely had a different view of the landscape, where he describes the mountains as being the things which are constantly moving, and rivers are actually the ones that are static, in his view, that because they're constantly flowing, that's their static nature. But mountains were constant, and even just traveling around parts of the South Asia, and you go up into the Himalayas and places where they're constantly landslides and things transforming the landscape constantly there. So good. So that's I think that's a really important insight, actually, in terms of thinking about how, I think there was so much in Braudel's work that that resonated with me here in certain aspects of his work, but I think the way that it's nuanced in your own book is very important.
It's a different perspective on the environment. Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Yes, good. So one other theme that I saw turn up in a few places in the volume was a very interesting claim about how what is revealed in this book, this collection of essays, and I think some of the individual essays even try to touch on this themselves, is that the conclusions somehow differ from the romanticized notions that some historians of the pre-modern Indian Ocean have imagined. And so I was curious to hear a little bit about, if you could say something about that as well. What is the difference here between, say, earlier scholarship on the Indian Ocean and what were those romanticized notions, and what does this volume bring to that story?
Well, first of all, we were going to focus on the relevance and the resilience of the Indian Ocean space in modern times. This is, of course, an argument that I made in my own book, 100 Horizons, which you mentioned, that came out in 2006. There is, in fact, a lot of good scholarship on the pre-modern and the early modern period in Indian Ocean history. But there was always a sense that the old organic unity of the Indian Ocean was just ripped apart with the onset of European imperial domination. And we were trying to show that, in fact, while there were qualitative changes, the connections, the flows continued in extremely important ways. But for example, in addressing the question of cosmopolitanism, and this book does try to contribute to the theories of universalism and cosmopolitanism, what we see in terms of Muslim cosmopolitanism may be rather different from the older romanticized versions. So for example, Sunil Amrit shows in his essay how, in fact, there was what he calls a lived and pragmatic cosmopolitanism that brought together Chinese Muslims and Tamil Muslims in Southeast Asia. Seema Alavi, in her essay, talks about the cosmopolitanism in the interstices of the Ottoman and the British empires in the later 19th century. So all of these Muslims were thinking beyond their own territorial locations, but we didn't want to reify the question of difference. We didn't want to say that everything was a seamless syncretism. How were differences being accommodated? And I think Ayesha could actually say more, since she looked at the voyages of Muslims from the Gangetic Plain and also the Indus Valley in the late 19th and early 20th century. And she would be best able to explain what she means by the intimacies that she found that connected Muslims in what we call South Asia and the Middle East, but which we can conceptualize as a unified Indian Ocean cultural ecumene.
I mean, one of the things that most sort of, I'm sorry, did you have a question?
No, I was just going to say, this would be wonderful, Ayesha, because I think your essay does touch perfectly on this. And maybe in your response, you could explain a little bit more about this conception of Islamic universalism and Muslim cosmopolitanism, just to explain it for those who might not be so familiar with the concepts and as they play out in this region. And even further, because of discussing these connections in quite dramatic, large scale geographic, I mean, it's incredible when you think about the distances involved here. What were some of the mechanisms for those, establishing those intimacies in terms of flows of perhaps people, but also new technologies, I think, are probably involved here, and maybe print and things like that. But so if you could touch on that, be great.
Well, I think one of the things that I will say about, since your earlier question was about the pre-modern, is that I believe that the connectivities that we are talking about were always there. I mean, of course, technologies have changed, but the sort of movement of peoples, of ideas, of material objects, it's not something that starts with the modern period. It has a much longer, deeper history. And people have always felt that they have belonged, albeit in an imaginal sense, to a broader Islamic world, or even an Islamic Indian Ocean world. So I think that has to be allowed, that people had different ways of imagining, oral, visual, and whatever, written, and those existed. I mean, if we look at the 19th and 20th centuries and talk about the arrival of print and steam and how that transformed things, I mean, at one level, there was this presumption amongst Indian Ocean historians that the important part of the Indian Ocean that needed to be studied was before the colonial period. Mm-hmm. And Sugata tried to corrected that with his 100 Horizons by looking at the colonial period. This book comes in as a sort of collected volume on the Indian Ocean rim. And I think what we're trying to sort of show is that this connectivity, of course, is expedited at one level. But what also happened in this period was a great deal, there was a twin kind of problem for the British. One was the pilgrimage and the suspicion surrounding that, and the fear that this was going to, any movement of Muslims, pilgrims, was seen to sort of not only bring disease, but also political sedition. Mm-hmm. So that, I think, is extremely important. That's where the focus has been. And as a result of that, this emotion of wanting to sort of belong to a broader Islamic world, even if you're sort of sitting in Ajmer Sharif in India, it was seen as pan-Islamic, political. What I've been able to argue here is that it came from an emotive, cultural relationship that could have been imaginal. But what does happen through this process and colonial networks, whether it's Thomas and Cook, where employees are sort of already working in Jeddah or some other part, and they're receiving these people who are coming from India, and so there's this great intimacy. It's not just coming to as a tourist, you actually already have people. And I think those interconnectivities need to be looked at more than I have been able to. I think that opens up a research opening for many people, for us to really understand the Indian Ocean cultural arena a lot better. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what, so there are three levels: people, ideas, and objects that are moving. You ask about cosmopolitanism. Not an easy word. I mean, cosmopolitanism was used to sort of somehow get away from fundamentalism, but we discover that there's, you can have rather sort of rabid views and still be cosmopolitan. I think we concede that at certain times. But I think what we are being able to show is that this universalistic aspiration is a sentiment that is much bigger than what pan-Islamism tries to, like fundamentalism, tries to convey. The relationship amongst Muslims is not always just political. And the reason why the Ummah is not seen as a serious entity is because it has no political unity. But I do think that those cultural dimensions should not be lost sight of in the process of sort of admitting the absence of unity, which I do throughout my own article, because there is no unity, but there is a sentiment and an emotion. And I do think that should be given credence as an imaginal idea that fires people now and again. I don't know whether I've been able to answer, but Islamic universalism is the belief that you belong to a broader community for whom the iconic individual is the Prophet. I think that's the community of the Prophet, that is very much universal. The other thing I would say is that, we are trying to move from the Eurocentric sort of arguments to suggest that there were competing universalisms. And certainly this was one of them as well. I don't know whether I've been able to fully answer.
Yes.
Yeah, well, just to add, while we have focused on a cultural ecumene, some notion of Muslim cosmopolitanism in the realm of culture, we do keep in play the larger historical context of European imperialist aggression in the period from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And I think Ayesha prefers the phrase Balade Islam, or a Muslim world, as it was being imagined, rather than the legalistic sort of Darul Islam. Also, in her article, she quotes Iqbal, who was traveling in 1931, And he is making an argument against the term pan-Islamism. He's saying that the prefix pan is actually quite unnecessary. It was a pejorative term manufactured by a French journalist to begin with. In the same way, we might say that the prefix pan is really unnecessary to add to Asianism as well. And what we do find in the, let's say, the early 1920s, for example, is that even in an age of nationalism, there are affiliations that are being forged beyond the boundaries of an imagined nation. These could be of many different kinds. They could be Islamic universalism, they could be Buddhist universalism, there could be communist internationalism, and so forth, in the same period. I think this is what Ayesha was alluding to when she talked about competing or multiple universalisms. And since you're a scholar of Buddhism, James, I think it's quite interesting to note that in a country like Burma, or what was a province of British India really until 1937, there was a good deal of coexistence and accommodation and intellectual and political exchange between the strands of Muslim universalism and Buddhist universalism. For example, Sana Iyer shows in her article how in the Khilafat movement, which was being led by Gandhi as part of his non-cooperation effort in India, in the Shwedagon temple, you have Uttama actually welcoming pro-Khilafat Muslims. So this was a very different period from the one that we see now, where these ideologies of religion, having been linked to modern nation states, have created conflicts which may not have been evident in the period that we are studying. And that's why, while Niall Green has written about the divisive discourses between Buddhists and Muslims, what Sana is able to show in her article is also something of an exchange that was taking place between the two.
Even I would even say that there was a sense of, from reading her article, even an expression of a strong sense of solidarity, even perhaps.
Yes.
And so one of the things that, in fact, even in Sana Ayar's article, which I think brings up an issue that I think brings to the surface maybe some of the challenges of discussing universalism and cosmopolitanism, is how, and I think you did everyone in this volume did a really interesting and effective job of doing this, is how does one balance universalism and cosmopolitanism and those claims with issues of the particular and the local and the regional, and to show that these are not mutually exclusive things. And I thought what I thought was a really, really important insight throughout, it seems that it came out not necessarily as a kind of a theoretical perspective that one wanted to just make, but it actually came out of very close readings and histories of particular areas. So with that, I'd be curious to hear you reflect a little bit on this issue, just to push a little further of the relationship between, say, the cosmopolitan, the universal, and the local throughout this Indian Ocean region.
I mean, there's a constant interplay. And I mean, that's why to sort of say anything decisive about it, that Muslims are fanatics, or that hinterland cities in the hinterland are not cosmopolitan, is just not really possible. You really have to be contextualized and specific and look at the interplay to judge. But I think that what this experience of doing this volume did for me was to make all of this come alive and make us realize that there's just so much more to be done. And it's about interconnectivities at so many levels. We haven't talked a lot about the material culture, but that's really crying out to be done effectively. And there is such a world out there. I see that some younger people have started exploring the oral aspects of the Indian Ocean connections. And I look forward to that, helping in that process. But there's always been there. So there's just a lot of stuff that can be done by breaking down. I mean, sometimes our analytical categories have been more of a burden than facilitators in really looking at these interconnections and almost a parallatic vision of the Indian Ocean. There's so many different ways of looking at it. So these framings have actually hindered us. We in this book try to make a small attempt to look slightly differently. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Yes, you've seized on something, James, that, there is no necessary contradiction between love for a regional homeland, often referred to in Urdu as Watan, and some kind of an allegiance with a larger Muslim world. I mean, this comes across, as you say, in the fine-grained narratives in many of the essays. So, for example, when Ayesha writes about Mahbub Alam, I mean, she writes about the great figures as well, Said Ahmad Khan, who traveled by the ship Baroda in 1869, and then Maulana Shibli Nomani in 1892, and then Iqbal in 1931. But to me, in some ways, the account left by Mahbub Alam is fascinating. When he's leaving Punjab, there is a sense of Punjabiness, and he's being given a warm send-off, and people are giving him food at the railway stations in Punjab. Then he goes to the port city of Bombay. But then once he eventually reaches the Ottoman domains, he's so warmly welcomed, whether in Istanbul or Cairo or Damascus or Beirut. And he seems to have such a sense of intimacy with people who he's encountering there. This takes away nothing from the fact that he comes from the Punjab region. He brings out a paper there called the Paisa Akbar and so forth. The contradiction that emerges is a different one, and that is between a sense of cosmopolitanism, Muslim cosmopolitanism, or an Islamic or even an Asian universalism, and the modern nation state. And that's why we connect our study of of Islam and the Indian Ocean with the partition of the regional homelands of Punjab and Bengal. And we end our introduction with a reference to Ram Manohar Lohia, who is visiting Gandhi in Noakhali in 1946, and Jawaharlal Nehru is there. And Nehru is saying that I can't really, relate to the water and the slime that I see all around me in Bengal. It's so different from North India, where I come from. And Lohia is very surprised. He thinks that under other circumstances, one should make an argument for connecting the upper Gangetic plain with its luxuriant terminus in the delta in Bengal. But now that partition has entered the mindset, the geography of Bengal appears to be abominable. And that's why, after showing how the Ganga and the Indus deltas and valleys were so connected to the Indian Ocean, we end our introduction by saying that the partition, particularly of these two regional homelands, was a crime against nature and humanity, for which the subcontinent is still
in the environment. I quote the meeting of the scientists who call it the biggest ecological disaster to have occurred. I think that's the subtle. I mean, if we think about this as the largest unbroken alluvial plain, and in our current context of environmental concerns, we just don't look at it. So I think that's the other thing that emerges from our work, is a different way of looking at this region from an environmentalist perspective. I think that's what we hope that this will also achieve.
Sure. And the implications, that was exactly what I wanted to bring up, which I was going to do a little later, but since you raised it, it's a perfect segue into it, is that that notion of the impact of first partition in 1947, but then also just the nature of changings of geopolitical nature of nation states and all of that in the post-colonial period, and what that created and the implications for that. I think it comes out obviously in your introduction. I think in Sunil Amra's paper chapter also, he's raising that question. So you see a kind of on the environmental impact is a really interesting one, because you have places that are obviously now falling between or across divisions that are now totally unnatural. Do you think that are we in a different place now, say, more recently than where things were at in terms of that post-colonial period? Do you think? Is that starting to...
In terms of scholarship, James, I feel that students, my own included, are no longer confining themselves to the boundaries of nation states. They're looking at ecological zones. And I find that a much more exciting, potentially, I mean, even if we are looking at the Rohingya crisis, for instance, as one of my students is, I mean, he's placing it in a much broader ecosystem to understand how we've come to this pass. I mean, the nation state boundaries have been the ultimate disaster, but a history precedes that we need to connect with what has come to pass. And I think, again, I'd like to come back to say that, you know, it's really our own analytical categories that we have to constantly question, because they become burdens on us. And I think that's what we were able to do. And I think our contributors did the same as well, to question these categories through nuance and rigorous empirical research.
I would say it stretches beyond just even analytic categories, actually. And I mean, I would perhaps even say that it even challenges our institutional structures of higher education and our universities in the way that we divide things up. So the younger scholars now are actually kind of ahead of the game here, where the institution hasn't caught up yet with the ways of approaching things in these new and different ways. I mean, that's my kind of personal view, but
I think that's a subject for real discussion. I think you really hit it on the head, that the younger people have got the message, but the institutions are finding it very hard to give up the old ways and incorporate. I mean, they will verbally tell you that they agree, but they are not being able to make the change yet.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sugata, please.
But yeah, we are, we were doing an exercise in true interdisciplinary history. We were also trespassing across very creatively, I think, the boundaries around area studies. South Asia is not separate from Southeast Asia or the Middle East, as we were able to show by looking
or East Asia too.
Or East Asia too, Islam across the Indian Ocean world. What I will say, geopolitics, which you were referring to, does matter. And there was about a 4-decade period, I think, from the late 40s to the late 80s, when these movements, these circulations were disrupted. Those 4 decades were the heyday of the modern nation state in the Indian Ocean arena and across Asia. But from about the 1990s until, I would say, shall we say about 2015 or so, many of these connections were being reforged. But of late, in just the last few years, I think we are beginning to see again a pushback with the rise of narrow nationalisms once again, or narrow-minded religious majoritarianism, which is very different from the old-style religious universalisms, whether of the Muslim or the Buddhist varieties that we've talked about. And if I might return just a little bit again to your probing about, cosmopolitanism, we engaged with Niall Green a bit, because we suggested that he's a bit unsure whether Bombay Islam is cosmopolitan or not. At one level it is. There are all these textual products that are circulating all the way to South Africa and many parts of the Middle East. And yet he says, but ultimately this Islam, this religious economy, he uses the market model, he says is particularist rather than cosmopolitan. And I think the theoretical point that we were trying to make is that let's not make this dichotomy between reformist and customary Islam. If we study Islam in the context of the Indian Ocean, then we might see many different kinds of accommodations between these forms. That's something that we studied also while bringing in the great river deltas into the study of the Indian Ocean, and not just ports and emporia. We also wanted to make the point that it's not just the big cities which matter, which is why Sunil Amrit's essay is so fascinating, because he's looking at Nagaur, which is a small town in Tamil Nadu. And one of his key characters is Shahul Hamid, who travels around the Indian Ocean. And then what we find is that there are replicas of his shrine, his dargah in Nagaur, in Singapore and Penang. Now, when Ayesha and I visited Singapore just a few years ago, we went to visit this shrine on Telokaya Street in Singapore. So we have these extant shrines in Singapore and Penang, but as Sunil suggests, that there were probably such shrines in Burma, Ceylon, Vietnam, and Indonesia as well. So even from these small towns on the coasts, not just the big cities, and from the agrarian hinterland of the Indian Ocean, there was this kind of cosmopolitan Islam and an aspirational Islamic universalism that was being articulated.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, actually, this may be too simplistic, but in a sense, the notion of a kind of Islamic universalism helps to deal with the potential problems of regional or localization, actually, and the cosmopolitanism sort of brings that together and allows those from the sort of hinterlands or other regions and things to then actually be part of something bigger and greater and arrive in a new place and actually be accepted. The one question I had, and this again is maybe my own lack of understanding of the region in a deep way, but it came out when I was reading Iftikhar Iqbal's essay, where he was the one, I think, in the book who really addressed this issue of language in a substantial way, where we're dealing. To me, it's quite head spinning actually to think that you're dealing with so many different languages across the region, from Arabic to Bengali to English to Urdu to other local vernaculars and everything else. So how do you think the issue of language played into this larger story that you're telling here as well? Language is obviously that, like water, that which connects people, but it also can be a really steep barrier for intercultural communication and intimacy. Yeah. But please, Ayesha?
You need to decide which period you're talking about. There was a Persianate world, there was an earlier world. In our period, clearly English is, it's the colonial period. And there, Urdu is actually a language that the British are promoting. And that actually doesn't, that doesn't remain confined to the subcontinent. But, there's Syed Ahmad talking about the sovereignty of Urdu. He goes to Aden, he finds people speaking Urdu. So I do think that we can't say that there is one language. Clearly it changes. So we need to be specific. I don't think that Urdu would be so widely spoken today. Probably English is a very important language now, but we are coming from Persian, moving towards a bit of a hype for Urdu during the colonial period, and then probably nosediving after the nation states come into play. And because now again, Arabic and other things are at play. But I do think that English becomes, that's the sort of irony for us decolonized souls, that English remains
it's a lingua franca, yeah. And then to say nothing of the flow of Chinese down into Southeast Asia, where it's now becoming kind of common language across that region as well.
Mandarin everywhere. I think it really depends, and so much can be done, I think, with the Indian Ocean and language on a broad scale. It would be fascinating.
I think that one lesson that we can draw from Iftikhar's article in particular, but from the volume as a whole, is that we are actually calling into question this contrast that is often drawn between universal languages and regional or vernacular languages. what Iftekhar shows is that, Bengali is not a regional language that is being counterposed to a universal language called Arabic. There are certain Islamic universalist aspirations that are being expressed in the Bengali language. And so, in a sense, it's a bit of a tussle between two universals, or a third as well, which is Urdu. So what is vernacular, what is universal is being called into question. Now, of course, if you think about the elite travelers who went around, particularly the ones that Ayesha talks about in her essay, they actually are able to converse in Arabic or Persian, sometimes even Turkish. And then they are, of course, thrilled to find that Urdu is in currency in a place
like remains, James. I mean, if you really, the post-Persian still. I mean, they're using Persian for the most part when they don't have Arabic. I mean, Iqbal doesn't have Arabic, but he has Persian. Shibli has Arabic. So it depends who the traveler is. But I think that your question is really well taken. That language really is crucial, how they communicated.
Yeah. I mean, I just as a humorous aside here, and perhaps is that, I mean, we all run into these in our own lives, right? Constantly when we travel and when we try to make connections across cultures. And remember hearing a friend who was in Poland and was in a library and didn't speak Polish. And so they went down the list of languages. Do you speak German? No. Do you speak Russian? No. Do you speak French? Okay, good. We'll do it in French. Or my colleague, a French colleague I worked with when we first met 15 years ago, I didn't speak French well enough to communicate our research project together. His English couldn't speak well enough for us to communicate. So we would sit in a cafe in Paris and speak Chinese to each other because that was our common language. It seems silly to look back on now, but that's the way it worked, And I'm sure the other patrons of the cafe thought we were absolutely crazy, but somehow it worked just fine. So.
But these affective bonds are quite important. It's not in this book, but I'm now trying to write a book called Asia After Europe. And I have a section on an Indian traveler, sociologist, Binoy Kumar Sharkar, who spent time in the United States of America, but also in Japan and China, where he visited in 1915-16. And he says that I could understand the language of my American friends and then English friends. But he says, even though I couldn't understand a word of what was being said to me in Japan or China, I, felt a certain kind of an intimacy. So it depends on the historical context. There were those who did not want to make too much of the quote unquote language barrier and still wanted to communicate, across them.
Yeah. And actually in both of your responses to this question and actually in some hints in earlier responses, actually touched on one of the final sort of themes that I thought was really interesting across the volume, even though we're dealing with the Indian Ocean as a body of water and rivers and all of that. But the one theme that seemed to come out of all the different chapters here was the way that all the authors structured their essays and really relied on using individual kind of biographies or stories about people. That really struck me as an interesting way to tell this story. And I was just curious if that was something that was reflected on in the makeup of the book, or it just became an effective sort of narrative strategy for helping to make the case that each of the authors was trying to make. And I think, Ayesha, yours obviously is focusing on precisely that. So maybe you could say a little bit of something about your thinking about the use of those.
I mean, as historians, we want voices. And the reason why because one can write abstract history, but only so much comes out of that. So I think that everyone was aware, and this emerges from a conference volume and subsequent revisions. So we did, I think, want people to be the ones to really reveal the dynamics that we wanted to talk about and not talk about them in abstraction. We wanted as practice as much as was possible. So I think those are the sorts of things that came out of our conversations at the conference. But Sugata, you want to add? I mean, there have been revisions, quite a few revisions. Sana's is a transformative essay from the initial one, and Iftikhar's as well. But Sugata might want to add a little bit.
Yes, all of the participants came and presented their work at the Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies that Ayesha directs. So, and we had lots of conversations and exchanges. One of the things that we wanted to do was that, each of the contributors has written an important research monograph, but we wanted one volume that we could present to a wider readership, those who may not be able to go through each of these books. So, I had written 100 Horizons, but I wanted to be a part of this, collective exercise. The point of departure for Ayesha was a book, Partisans of Allah, which had looked at many of the links between what we call South Asia and the Middle East across the Western Indian Ocean. We had Seema Alavi, and we actually wanted her to talk about at least two of the individuals. She has written about many other individuals, but Maulana Karanvi and Imdadullah Makki. And there are interesting connections. When Mahbub Alam, one of Ayesha's characters, goes to Istanbul, he finds that his interlocutors have read Maulana Karanvi's work on Christianity, on religion, and so forth.
Into Turkish. I mean, so yes. So that's. I mean, this is exactly. We've heard about this, but what I found in these works was actual evidence, and I wanted to bring that out. And I think that because these have been sort of posited, but we do. I think historians need to do this sort of work more. Is what I feel.
And we did press as editors for actual lives, actual biographies to be included. Perhaps the one work which looks at just surveillance is Eric Tagliacozo's, but he had written a book called The Longest Journey, a wonderful book on the Hajj from the Malay world. But he was able to, there are spin-offs from these research monographs that are almost as important as those individual books. So when we spoke to Andrew Sartori and Iftikhar Iqbal, writing both about Bengal, we needed a character like Maulana Bhashani, who had mobilized the Assamese, the Bengali Muslim peasantry in Assam and so forth. And the characters were important. Shahul Hamid for Sunil Amrit, U Uttama and his Muslim interlocutors for Sana. And actual people, their interactions, their thoughts, their writings is what made the volume come alive, and they met at various crossroads across the Indian Ocean.
Actually, for somebody who is not spending every day kind of immersed in this research or in unable to read every single monograph that comes out, I mean, it really does serve this purpose of introducing a reader like myself to a much richer sense of these issues and particular topics, and actually leads you then into that research. I mean, we didn't get a chance to discuss so much Eric Tagliacozo's essay on the Hajj and surveillance across the Indian Ocean, but I was really fascinated by that idea of surveillance and control. And also Chris Manjapra, is that the right pronunciation? Yeah.
Yes.
I thought that essay, with the connections to German intellectuals, for me, was just a really fascinating story. It was a little bit different than some of the other types of questions that were being raised, but really, really interesting intellectual history and explored from a couple of different angles.
Eric Tagliacozo's essay is so relevant at this moment because all this surveillance started. Yes. With the cholera epidemic of 1865. And there were these European powers who were all very concerned about disease in all senses of the word. So rereading Tagliacozo in the middle of the pandemic, really offers some fresh insights. And
Mm-hmm.
Chris Manjapra, we really have to thank, because he was in a way one of the organizers, along with Ayesha, of these wonderful meetings at Tufts University. And he too has, of course, a wonderful research monograph of his own, which is his Harvard Ph.D. thesis, revised Age of Entanglement, on
Mm-hmm.
German and Indian intellectual encounters. But what he was able to offer was a notion that the Indian Ocean, or Islam across the Indian Ocean, was not facing a monolithic Europe.
Yes.
That there were challenges.
Which is corroborated by some of the things I found. For instance, the attitudes were different from among Italians or the French compared to the British. So there is this view of the conquered, the conquering race and their hubris. So I think that is corroborated what Chris is arguing in other things.
And people were important for Chris as well. So
Yes.
whether it's Muhammad Shahidullah or whether it's Muhammad Iqbal, they are both engaging with the German sort of intellectual approach to the study of Islam. And so it's the people, the scholars, who are the focal point.
Now, I would love to just end with one final, just less of a question and more of an opportunity for either or both of you. We've discussed many different themes and woven in some discussion of some of the essays, but those were things that caught my eye as I was going through, but I was wondering if there was any thing that we might have missed in terms of a particular theme or issue that you'd like to highlight about the volume, or that you thought came out particularly clearly in any particular essay as well. So just as an open opportunity to raise any other topic that you felt was important to you in publishing this volume.
You were able to make us cover a lot of ground with your very perceptive questions. But at the most general level, what I might want to add in conclusion is that in our historiography, sometimes the study of the Indian Ocean and the study of Islam has proceeded along, parallel tracks. And we were able to mix these two up, I think, in a very creative way. Also, even though we didn't want to be too deliberate about this objective, since we were based at the Fletcher School at Tufts when we were having many of these discussions, we felt that a proper scholarly understanding of Islamic universalism or Muslim cosmopolitanism in the Indian Ocean zone can, in fact, influence for the good the thinking of both policymakers, but also public perceptions of this region and also of Islam, which are sometimes, sadly, very skewed. So there was a desire to reach, beyond the academy without giving up a bit on academic scholarly rigor, but, make both the Indian Ocean and Islam in that arena intelligible in a meaningful way to a wider readership and audience.
What I would have liked to have talked more and even done more and seen more, and I think maybe that's something we should plan on, is material culture.
Yeah.
Many other aspects that I think would make the Indian Ocean so much more livelier than we know it. And I think that's really what it makes it. And I hope that this book will encourage people to do so. Maybe we can do a bit of our own as well. But I really do think that it was a very enjoyable project at the end of the day, and I'm glad it sort of came together. It's not easy.
No, it's not.
As you probably know.
Yeah. Actually, the issue of material culture is one that I kept asking myself as I was reading it too, is, you talk about steamships and the shifting to that in movement, but what are they shipping? What kinds of, there was some actually, and some of the essays I thought were quite interesting, how they described, shifting from rice to jute and other types of products. And there's a whole kind of trajectory and the transformation of, say, agricultural products and all of that, in addition to other types of things that I think really would be fascinating to follow up on at some point. It was certainly something that caught my eye in little snippets throughout the book, and yeah, they were intriguing and called out for more. Yeah.
And the people were traveling on cargo ships very often, and so you do hear stories about what goods are being unloaded and what are being loaded at the different ports. But in some ways, as an Indian Ocean historian, I don't mind that we emphasized culture more than trade, which was the obsession of an earlier generation of Indian Ocean historians. Of course, we must always try to blend the study of political economy and culture. But if in this volume, we have leaned more towards the Indian Ocean as a cultural ecumene, I don't think that's been such a bad thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's for me. Some time ago, I had read what's his name, George Horani's Arab Seafaring, right? And the real emphasis on trade there just is overwhelming, right? So this was I think a nice, and that was in a sense the most obvious question too, was which I didn't lead with, which could have, and you addressed it in your final comment, was the focus on Islam and connecting it to this history. I think it actually is not an obvious point. I think for most people that would see the title necessarily. So I think you explained it very nicely in terms of how that is an addition to the previous forms of approaches to the Indian Ocean. So let me end by thanking you both very much for this discussion. I learned a tremendous amount from reading the volume, and really made me think in very different ways about so many different parts of South and Southeast Asia, and also actually thinking ahead then to what are the implications of this, because we're led up right to a moment now to think a little bit about what the impact going forward in the future of this region. And that's why I opened up our conversation with that quote, because it really was the one that kind of hits you in a sense to imagine what that is going to be like in, say, 15, 20 years, or maybe even shorter, that region and its impact on geopolitics and trade and culture and how that's being reconfigured. So thank you both very much for taking the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, James, for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.